My name is Kenny Farquharson. I'm a columnist with the Times newspaper. It's my honour to be here with you this evening, once again at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I was telling a friend of mine that I was slightly daunted being among these Rolls-Royce mines while driving a Reliant Robin, but we shall have to bear with me, so bear with me. We're here tonight to discuss the subject of assisted dying. The motto of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, as you probably know, is knowledge made useful. Well, this is precisely the kind of subject that where expert knowledge, whether through science or personal experience, has a crucial role to play in the national conversation. Before we go any further, I have some housekeeping. You'll be delighted. We always like the housekeeping, don't we? There will be, in the event of an emergency, you can see some details here for what you should do in the event of emergency. The exit is at the back. You probably came in that way. There's also, I feel like a air stewardess. There's also an exit here on your right. There's a gathering point outside the Dome nightclub, which I'm sure you know, on the right-hand side as you come out there. There will be an opportunity for a big chunk of this evening's proceedings are going to be for you to ask questions of the panel. And it's this essential part of the evening's proceedings, for you to grill them. And I hope you will show no mercy when you do so. It's an essential part of what we're trying to do here. I should also perhaps spell out some of the ground rules. There's been a lot of thought gone into how this is conducted this evening. This has been a debate, a conversation. I'm trying to avoid the word debate. A conversation that RSE has been trying to have for some time, and a lot of thought's been gone into how it's conducted. And a few ground rules then. The first is that the RSE, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, does not have a position on assisted dying. The purpose of this event is to illuminate the national conversation with knowledge, insight, and analysis. So this event isn't a debate. I mistakenly used that word earlier on. It's hard to move, not to get caught up with that word. This is it's a discourse rather than a debate, and that is a deliberate choice. That's a deliberate choice in this conversation. We don't want an argument. We want a discussion. And so the panelists that you see before you have been chosen for the expertise they bring to this subject, and not for their views favouring one side or other in what can be quite a contentious debate. So I think we have that understanding, but that's what we're doing here. Okay, this isn't a debate with one side against another. This is about bringing expertise and personal experience, which we've got a lot of on the panel, to bear on a highly delicate and contentious subject. So with that, can I introduce, to make some opening remarks, Liam McArthur MSP, who is the sponsor of the Private Member's Bill on assisted dying before the Scottish Parliament just now.
Thanks very much, Kenny. Thank you all for being here this evening. I think my contribution is going to be a little different to that I'm used to. You're going to be spared my usual elevator pitch on assisted dying. That's no bad thing. There's probably plenty of time for that on other occasions. Can I warmly thank the Royal Society of Edinburgh for making this event possible, allowing hopefully a safe space, a comfortable space, to have a discussion about what is a complex, a sensitive issue, but it's an issue that I've got to know over a number of years now matters a great deal to most people. It is an issue that we don't necessarily, in the political environment I operate in, discuss nearly enough. We spend an awful lot of time discussing how we might improve the quality of life, but I think relatively little time discussing how we improve the quality of death. I think the other thing that has come home to me in the last couple of years in particular in developing the bill is that it opens up a conversation much wider than the conversation about whether or not you're supportive or not of a change in the law to allow for assisted dying. It opens up a discussion around other end-of-life choices. It opens up discussions about palliative care. What is palliative care? I mean, it has been, I think, quite surprising to me the extent to which palliative care is often misunderstood by many people, even those within the medical professions. But as I say, it's a debate that profoundly matters to so many people. It's a debate, I'm pleased to say, that in a political environment where it is increasingly difficult to lead measured, respectful conversations or even debates, this is one where I get the impression from the conversations I have with colleagues across the parties, there is a recognition of the seriousness of it, the complexity of it, the sensitivity of it, and the need to treat those issues with respect and in a measured fashion. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our panellists have to say this evening on the issues that touch on this. I'm sure the expertise is clearly not just limited to the panel. I can see a number around the room this evening whose contribution to this debate is going to be equally valuable. So I look forward to sitting back and listening. If there are questions about specific aspects of the bill that people feel that I might be able to assist in clarifying, more than happy to do that. But as I say, I'm looking forward to sitting back, listening to the discussion. I'm sure it will be a fascinating and illuminating one. The bill itself is in the early stages of its consideration by the Health Committee in the Scottish Parliament. That's likely to take place over the course of the rest of this year. So there's going to be plenty more time to have discussions like this. But thank you very much indeed for coming along in such numbers. Thank you very much indeed, Kenny, and to the RSE for making this possible. And I hope you find this evening enjoyable. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Liam. And as Liam says, he's going to be here for the Q&A later on. If there's anything that you need specifically addressed to him, he'll be more than happy to address it. So can I introduce you to our panel this evening? From the far end, first of all, Dr. Kirsten Woolley is a GP in Craigmillar and a professional advisor to the Scottish Government on practitioner wellbeing in health and social care. Next to her, the Reverend Scott McKenna is a parish minister in the Church of Scotland with parishes in Uddingston, Edinburgh and Ayr. Next to him, Dr. Margaret McCartney is a practicing GP and a senior lecturer at the University of St Andrews. Professor Scott Murray is a retired GP and emeritus professor of primary palliative care at the University of Edinburgh. And Linda Towers is a lawyer who is convener of the Constitutional and Human Rights Committee at the Royal Society of Scotland and is a visiting professor at the University of Strathclyde. And can I ask you just to show your appreciation of them being here? Thank you. I'm going to ask each member of the panel to address one of three different aspects of this debate. First of all, we're going to look at contexts, where we are now, where we start from. Second, we're going to look at the lessons to be learned from elsewhere in the country, other nations elsewhere who have laws or have tried to introduce laws on assisted dying. And thirdly, we're going to look at practicalities. Where do we go from here? What happens now? So on the first one, on where we are now as a society, what is our experience of dying, of death now? First of all, I'm going to come to Scott Murray. First of all, Scott, what form does assisted dying take now?
Thank you. So assisted dying now in 24 takes the form of palliative care. I'm biased, of course, being a professor of palliative care, but it actually assists people to die. But more than that, actually assists people to live well and then die well and grieve well. There's a public-facing campaign called Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief. I hope some of you have heard it. The idea is to say palliative care is about living well and then dying well. So there is now a large body of evidence which supports this approach of palliative care, especially early palliative care, which can prevent suffering and giving person-centred continuing care. And so I'm going to try to make that research useful, as Kenneth has invited us to do. And I've distilled it into 4 alls about palliative care. Okay, so that's it. Palliative care, first of all, can help people with all illnesses towards the end of life. When an illness becomes life-threatening, when we start thinking about things, that's when we're suggesting it should start. So all illnesses, what do people die of nowadays? Well, they used to die quickly before. Now folk have dying slightly longer. There are 3 main categories: people who are dying of progressive cancer, and that's quite well known and relatively quick and recognised. Palliative care can help these people in many ways. Also, more people in cancer actually die of organ failure. That's when the heart or the lungs or the liver or the kidneys pack up. And they die in a slightly different illness trajectory where they have dips and get better again. And you need palliative care for a longer period of time. That can be for years. And they also benefit from palliative care over the duration of that. And the most common group of declining trajectories nowadays is frailty. It's a slower one. It's like doing a slow waltz compared to a fast tango in organ, if you wish. Okay. So, but all these illness trajectories, palliative care isn't just about cancer in the last days and weeks of life. A lot of people, as Liam suggested, think it is that, or traditionally that's been thought. It was never that in the first place. It develops into that. So, first point, there is good research evidence of people have needs in all these trajectories, and even intervention studies of training people better, so that for instance, cardiac nurses trained in palliative care can be part of the team to support heart failure people. Same with renal and the liver failure patients, and we've done with that. So the first thing, all illnesses, even stroke. There was a professor of stroke said, stroke, palliative care doesn't work. But if you have a serious stroke, carer immediately thinks, might die. And so a palliative care approach is vital in that. So the first all is all illnesses. The second all is all times. Palliative care should start early in the illness, as soon, and then there's plenty of time to chat with the person. You might think some people don't really want to talk about their illness, what happened in the future, they're a bit scared, and they often are. But if you were say, well, you've got this, maybe you don't want to talk about what you've got, but would you like to hear a bit about, how the illness goes for people that have had your condition? Most people would like to hear about that so they can be more informed, because we know that people aren't very death literate. We're trying to help folk. All times is really vital in improvement. When we start talking together, building up continuity of care, talking about, it used to be advanced care planning. In Scotland, it was anticipatory care planning. Now it's future care planning. We're trying to find the best word, and it shouldn't have a frightened name. And in the care, palliative care should not, in the old days it stopped, curative care stopped, and then it was time for palliative care. Now, at life-threatening illness, we start introducing a palliative care approach, and so palliative care is adding on. It's an extra thing. It's not doing less, it's doing more. Doctors should never say, I could do nothing for you. So that was the second all. The third all, so all diseases, all times, all dimensions of need. Okay, so dying is a 4-dimensional experience. I'm sure Scott would agree. Physical, psychological, social, and existential or spiritual. I got lung cancer 10 years ago. I was quite well at the time, but immediately, I was worried. My wife was worried. Most people die of lung cancer. Why have I got it? So early on, at the beginning of life-threatening, it's good for it to be acknowledged and the person supported. Do you get it? So early on, there's some, and dying has all the different dimensions. And each person, whatever illness you're on, there are trajectories towards the end of life of physical and psychological and social well-beings. Bit complicated. The latest trajectory, in fact, was a trajectory of, because most people die nowadays of more than one illness, and it's called multimorbidity. And our team from Edinburgh wrote a paper in May of this year on how to care for people, palliative care for people with more than one illness. So we continue, more evidence on that. So that was about all dimensions. All settings from last all. Okay, so it isn't just specialist palliative care, but people die everywhere. And there's 50,000 people in Scotland, I reckon 56,000 die a year. About 50,000 would benefit potentially from palliative care if you look back at everyone who died in a year, as I have done, you look at their last year of life experience, it's pretty horrendous. They get so much curative care. Palliative care is increasing, but even more than that, there's lots of different things that happen. And they can't see the doctor very well out of hours either. So there's lots of issues there. But so settings is actually, in also, palliative care approach is valid everywhere. Hospitals, in primary care especially, and in primary care, GPs now have the facility. They get funded a little bit in Scotland, not so in England. It's frail people that are identified in England, so they get extra support to try to do this. And you could run wee computer searches to find a patient who might benefit from this approach. So there's ways of making time to introduce this approach because it's so difficult when primary care is so fraught. So those are the 4 alls. I hope you'll take them with you. So, you know, if I could have a capsule of palliative care, palliatosin, have you heard of palliatosin? You know? You haven't. But if palliative care was a capsule, it has no toxic side effects and it gets to areas that normal capsules would. So it's a hard thing to describe. And when people, I know that both sides of the debate say that palliative care is a good thing, but if asking, so, well, have you tried palliative care yet? Tick yes or no. It's a very hard thing, I think, to actually, okay, that must be a fully informed information about palliative care. Because unless a person understands a real illness and what might be available for palliative care, maybe not so. So last sentence, I would like palliative care now to go viral in Scotland. That's what we need to do. There have been 2 recent bills in Parliament which actually have supported this, a carer's bill and a patient's bill, so that they get these support earlier than in England, in fact. And there'll be more of that. But we are well placed to fast forward quickly palliative care in all settings. So I rest my case. Let's press on with palliative care. I don't know if we need a bill for it that may be coming, but we must please resource that and we'd all feel better. We'd live better, die better, and grieve better. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Kirsten, in your experience as a GP, how much awareness is there among people of these definitions and the options that are available to them and the processes that we're discussing tonight?
Thank you. I think
Got to take the microphone. Thanks.
I think that's probably quite difficult to answer, and I think there's probably quite a broad range of awareness in different communities for different people. Interestingly, when I came in this room, I remembered the last time I was here was 10 years ago to hear Atul Gawande extolling the virtues of palliative care, and it was clear in that conversation that this country has a longer heritage and awareness of palliative care, as we've just heard from our professor, who are also calling Scott number 2 tonight.
Scott number 2.
But I think I think palliative care and DNAR forms are sort of often more typically medical language that we use, and they're understood between clinicians. But patients probably really only start to grapple with them when they're relevant to their own personal and individual and patient journeys, and when they're starting to approach what's possibly the terminal stages of a chronic illness or their final ailment. I think maybe there's been an increase in awareness as a result of the pandemic. There was guidance to encourage these types of conversations, but I suspect, given the complexity and some of the chaoticness that was throughout society at the time, it's unclear whether that has stuck into the society's psyche. So I think these are terms that probably aren't well understood, and obviously Scott's explained palliative care and DNAR forms that trip off the tongue is a do not resuscitate order, and I think that's also a very complicated one for patients to understand. And in some countries that's called an AND form, which is allow a natural death, and I think there's a subtlety in that language about what that means, and that's quite a lot for a patient and for their families to take on. So these are common conversations that we have in general practice. most often I'd say I probably have them in people's homes, sitting on the floor next to them with, you know, family members around, and there's always a lot for them to be taking on board in their conversations. You don't just have once, but you start and you have them repeatedly to help people to understand, you know, the impact of what these things mean, and that although DNAR often sounds like you're not doing something, it can feel like you're taking something away. And so the nuance of that is very subtle, and I think people's understanding of that can only be best optimised in the specifics of their own situation.
Margaret, can you expand on that? I mean, how difficult is it for people to make informed, evidence-based, rational decisions about medical care these days?
Yeah, really hard. So my big interest is in evidence-based healthcare, and it should be straightforward. You know, you shouldn't do crazy things because you think it's going to work. You should make recommendations as a doctor because you've got some good quality evidence that this is a good suggestion. And also you should have an appreciation of the unintended consequences, the side effects, the hazards, what else is going on. And I think somehow we've got ourselves in a position with, I think we've got ourselves in a societal muddle, I think almost, with, as Kirsten says, DNR forms do not resuscitate. It sounds like it's a very powerful thing for a doctor to prevent someone from living. You know, it sounds like a kind of doctor is God kind of thing. In reality, these forms are to protect people from having a very medicalised death. And I don't think we get that message across very clearly. I think sometimes people hear the words palliative care and they think they're giving up on me, when actually the converse is true. In my mind, what we're doing is we're prioritising the patient's values and the patient's quality of life, and that's what we're aiming to try and improve here. And we're maybe thinking less about cure, but we're definitely thinking about care. And I think sometimes people hear those words and think they're giving up on me, when actually I think it's often permission giving for the doctor, to be honest, to stop doing super invasive stuff that's not going to help. And in fact, there is evidence that for, you know, there was a big trial done on non-small cell lung cancer, palliative care actually produced better quality and quantity of life compared with usual care in America, where they were probably doing too much mad stuff. Anyway, I shouldn't have said that. But they were probably doing stuff that probably wouldn't have been done to the same extent, perhaps in other areas. But the bottom line is that too much medicine is often a really bad thing, and it doesn't help your quantity or quality of life. And yet our narrative so often is one that seems to infer that more is better, more is good, and less is bad, when actually the opposite is very often true in medicine. The great skill sometimes is in not acting rather than in acting. The great skill sometimes is in explaining to somebody that actually an intervention might not have the intended consequences and might actually make things worse. We know there is good systematic reviews saying that in general, doctors and patients tend to overestimate the benefits from interventions and underestimate the harms of them. So we are geared towards thinking that more is always good, when actually I think we need to take a huge step back from that and say, well, actually, what are the uncertainties in the evidence here? What are the pros? What are the cons? What might we be getting wrong? And these are all done with the best of intentions, so nobody's trying to do a bad thing here. It's just that the way that our psyches are gathered and the way that our media works and the way that we get information quite often is biased towards action rather than giving us fair and balanced information about all the potential possibilities of what one might or might not do.
Thank you. Scott McKenna, from you're a Church of Scotland minister. You couldn't tell by looking at you. You're talking about not wearing a tie today. From your pastoral experience, you know, what does it mean to people that you encounter and you minister to have a good death? What does it mean, and what is the difference between a good death and a bad death?
I suppose I wanted to maybe just tell two stories, and these are two individuals, but it could have been a whole host of different individuals. So two short stories, really. One is Alex Bain, who had an assisted death in Victoria, Australia. He was 28. He had an aggressive and rare cancer. His family say that assisted dying saved his life. For them, assisted dying was not about death. It was about life. And that was their lived experience. For the last few months of his life, Alex was no longer powerless, passive, fearing pain and fearing indignity. He died in his apartment, surrounded by his fiancée and family, and in a sense, AD shortened his death, not his life. By contrast, a few months earlier, some months earlier, as reported in the Scottish media, a woman, Heather Black of Edinburgh, died stripped of dignity and in distress, agitated and in agony. She had 3 daughters, and she asked her 3 daughters to kill her. And the family was traumatized. Pastorally, I've heard many stories of, well, not many stories, a number of stories, where a son has been asked by a mother or a father to kill them. The trauma is there, and people vividly recall it. It doesn't matter whether the bereavement is 10 days ago, 10 weeks ago, 10 months, 10 years ago. People can vividly recall a bad death. They recall it seems every nauseating detail. So in my view, pastorally and from others around the world, a bad death leads to a bad bereavement. And I would say that a good death is autonomy, participation in decision-making, the avoidance of infantilization, and the minimum use of medication. And so dignity, so for me, a good death is about dignity and peace. And when you listen to the stories of Alex Bain and Heather Black, which are reflected in my experience and many others, and you could have chosen any 2, it seems to me that that's the difference between a good death and a bad death.
That's a very powerful testimony. Thank you. Linda, from the Law Society, why are we having this debate? Is it how important is it that this matter becomes something on the statute book rather than something we leave in the very capable hands of some of our medical professionals, some of whom we have with us this evening?
I think that's perhaps the most important underlying question. We live in a society, by its very nature, has changed very much in what we as individuals expect to be allowed to do, to be allowed to be part of society. And the first time that this was considered in Scotland was in the year 2010, the first time there was an active bill. I was Solicitor at the Parliament at that time, and I was advising the committee that was considering that bill. It was novel, it was complex, it was very, very sensitive, and it was raising all sorts of questions that had not been raised in Scotland before. And it was against a background of a number of cases which had been heard in the Supreme Court in various steps and in Europe. The cases of Pretty, Purdy, and then eventually the case of Nicholson as well. And the Supreme Court in London, House of Lords, some of the cases were at that stage, took the view that this was such an important part of society and rights of people and protecting people, because it's protecting as well as allowing people, that had to be dealt with by the Parliament of the land, whether or not that was Westminster or in the context of Scotland, the Scottish Parliament. These are the people we have elected to make these very difficult societal issues to be considered for society. And therefore, what we have at the moment is a set of case law that says this is very, very difficult, this is very, very sensitive, but it's not for us, the judges, to make those decisions. It's for the elected representatives, if you wish to go down that route with all the issues that are arising. And I think that was probably the correct decision, because had we left it to the judges to make those really difficult decisions, they're not elected, they don't necessarily reflect all the people and the different views that are across society. But even that's not necessarily an answer of itself, because in the almost 15 years now, since these decisions, the first bill was down there, and these cases predated that, the whole attitude within society towards rights has changed, and questions of protection and how matters that are sensitive of that should actually be dealt with. We're much more aware of the Human Rights Act. We have ongoing issues at the moment in relation to the legislation in Scotland. We're about to get a new Scottish human rights bill. We are looking again at the mental health legislation and at the adults with incapacity legislation, and all sorts of issues which are around the question of rights for individual, but also protections for individual. The doctors are being left to deal with it without any guidance, and it seems to me that having legislation which is properly considered, addresses all the issues, is undoubtedly the way forward. Whether we pass the current legislation, whether this is the end of that story, not for us at this stage, but the discussions have to go on to reflect what is undoubtedly now an issue society is going to have to make some kind of decision on in order to assist not just the doctors, but the individuals involved, all the other people involved, advisors, lawyers, people giving pastoral care. That needs to be given some support in the context of a framework within which decisions of that kind can be made.
Thank you, Linda. That's good. So we've looked at the context. We've looked at where we are now and some of the definitions around these things. So the next section I'm going to ask the panel to address is lessons and warnings. And we're going to look at our bad examples from abroad, a lesson on how to do it better, or a warning not to do it at all. And we're also going to look at various interest groups and what their interest is in this. And Scott, I'm going to come to Scott McKenna. I'm going to come to you first, if you don't mind. With due respect, and please forgive me, but what rights do religious people have to be given a privileged role in this debate? You're here as a minister of the Church of Scotland. Why?
Especially in a society which is now 51% secular, as reported in the BBC today, I think. I don't think the church or religious people have a privileged position. That would be the first point. In a democracy, it's a basic point. In a democracy, every voice is welcome at the table, a person of faith or no faith. And that's true of religious organisations. They have a voice but not a veto. And that seems to me important. That's the first basic point. I suppose the second point I would make, that in my experience, for many people, the process of dying can lead to questions about the meaning of life, the meaning of my life, of love, values, God, family, forgiveness, belief in what lies beyond this life, if anything. These questions come up. And it seems to me these are bedside questions, bedside issues for many people who are dying. And therefore, there is naturally a place for people with a religious or a spiritual or even philosophical perspective to be involved and included in the conversation. I very often, just to kind of take the sting out of the word religion, I very often have people speak to me in their opening sentences, "I'm not religious, but..." And then they have a religious, spiritual kind of conversation. I think the other thing that's true in terms of being part of this debate and discussion is that it's very good that Fate, Friends at the End, and the Humanist Society are willing to offer support from the third sector for people going through the process of assisted dying and for their families. And they've said that, that's on record. But it's also true that across the world, clergy have and are supporting people who opt for assisted dying. And in Australia, for example, in the Uniting Church in Australia, the church has encouraged the clergy to honour the decision people have made and to support the person who's made that decision and to pastorally and spiritually support the family too. That was the Uniting Church in Australia, followed by the Anglican Church in Australia. I suppose one kind of final area here is that the Church in Scotland and the UK will follow suit with what's happening in other parts of the world in terms of supporting people if the legislation is passed, partly because it's motivated by a compassionate pastoral concern, and partly because of the enormous support for assisted dying within the membership of the mainline Christian churches. The statistics I have are 78% from the Church of England, people supportive of the principle of assisted dying, 6 to 8% from the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, obviously, different polls come up with different figures, but broadly speaking, that is the case. You will not hear that support from the official authorities of the church. It may shock you to learn that the authorities of the church don't always consult the membership of the church. But I would say that support for assisted dying across Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism is all there. So people of faith are part of society, and they have a voice to offer, and pastoral experience to offer.
Yeah, thank you, and apologies for my question.
Not at all.
That's why I'm here. Margaret, can I ask you to address some of the most vocal opposition to assisted dying is coming from people the people with disabilities, and how would you characterise their concern and where they put the place they hold in this debate? Do you want the...
In general, I think people with disabilities, I think, should be encouraged to speak up for themselves and be given a full voice at the table, rather than having it filtered through a doctor. But I can say that there's lots of surveys that I think have highlighted that many people have many concerns, and completely understandable. I mean, we have to remember that we're in a Scotland just now where our NHS is falling apart. It is falling apart. At the knees, social care falling apart. Cost of living crisis. People are struggling to do things day to day. Normal human things day to day. And I think it's very important to consider the context in which decisions are being made here. We're not all equal. Some people are struggling to do the basic stuff of life. We're not supporting our most vulnerable and poorest people in society even slightly well enough. And I think we really need to consider that when we're considering all the decision making and all the discussion in this space. The other thing I just want to say is that anecdotes are really powerful, often, and really useful, but they're not high quality scientific data. They certainly can provide a platform for you to go and start exploring things, but it's possible to have anecdotes to say that medical assisted dying was horrendous and awful or fantastic, or that you can find a story to fulfill whatever point of view you're wanting to have. But if we're going to make decisions, I would argue that they should be based on really high quality evidence. And that means looking for data in places that are not obviously presenting it, going and finding out where the gaps are. Now, if you go and look in Canada, there's a recent paper that have come out and people have went and looked where are the gaps in the data, where are the unknowns, where are the safety checks that should have been happening and aren't. And there's lots of concerns about that. So, when you're talking about making decisions on evidence, how high quality is that evidence? What are the gaps? What are the uncertainties? And there is lots and lots of them. But in terms of the real world and where this is going to be made, well, I followed the Gender Recognition Act very closely in Scotland to see how well decision making was done. And I have to say I was absolutely appalled. I should say one of my interests is I'm a director of Byra's Place. And when I look and see whose voices were heard, whose voices were not held, who was brought to the table, who was not, I'm really pretty appalled. And I have to say that has given me very little confidence that the Scottish Parliament is capable of providing a high quality assessment of the evidence and looking for the uncertainties and the gaps and the unknown when we were going forward to discuss this bill.
I might, in the Q&A, I might ask Liam to address that very point, because there's been some discussion about that. There was some people writing in the press saying that this debate was very unlike the debate on gender, but the I think concerns are certainly there. So maybe it's something you can address at that later point. Linda, I realise this is an impossible question, but what are the lessons from other countries that are most pertinent to this debate? You mentioned in your first remarks about the idea of personal rights. And I know that in Canada, that has been a kind of John Stuart Mill idea of personal autonomy and free will has been one of the driving forces behind that, and one of the defining forces, and maybe perhaps one of the flaws in that legislation. What can we learn from abroad, good and bad?
I think what we can learn from abroad are what options are available, various things that can be done, and what would fit in that society. What I don't think we should be doing is saying, well, it worked fine in some bit of Canada, therefore it's going to be perfect for us, because we are a different kind of society. We have different ways we operate, we have different controls, we have different states of our health service, all these various things which can all be very relevant. Therefore, I think it can be no more than guidance and things to think about, to work out what works best for our society. And I don't mean that in a non-inclusive way, because again, things might be better in different parts of the country. We're quite an odd country, if I can put it that way, in that we've got a central belt, which is very much more centralised than rural areas and the islands and things like that, which may require different kinds of provision. And therefore, what might work in a particular state elsewhere doesn't necessarily work here. And I think also our different attitudes, we're at different stages of addressing things like human rights and autonomy and what our society would accept. Therefore, I think that there are real issues on that side. So I think it can be no more than guidance. And I don't think we should be accepting things without saying, well, how is that going to work best in our particular areas? I mean, one of the things, if I could just perhaps preempt Liam on the whole gender recognition debate, one of the issues which I think may well be thought about because of the particular nature of this, and again, it actually impinges on what happens elsewhere, is whether or not this particular debate would be allowed to be a conscience issue, and therefore people would not be whipped, i.e. told by their party how they had to vote. And I think the gender recognition one, by all accounts, looking at it from outside as opposed to from inside, but I think there was certainly a degree of that going on for whatever reasons, which we don't need to consider now. But I think if this were to be done on a free vote, which would allow people to vote along with their conscience, then that may make it an easier vote at the end of the day, but it does mean that our representatives would have to be well informed to be able to go out and discuss it with their constituents as to how they should be taking it forward. And I think that may be a way forward. It's not going to answer all the questions, but at least it's a way of addressing that.
I see we have at least one other MSP in the room with us today, which is very welcome. Kirsten, can I ask, what happens when a family's, a person's family, partner, friends, siblings, or the community around them object to something which may or may not be in a patient's best interests?
Are you talking in our current context, or specifically looking in the future too?
In the future, really, kind of as a what if.
Yeah, so I think from what I've understood from what I've been able to read about the bill, the views of the family aren't mentioned in it, and that this is a decision for the individual, and then the assessments are to be undertaken by two registered medical practitioners. So the views of the loved ones and the community doesn't really feature in the notes that I've read so far. And I guess as a GP, I found that struck a chord with me and gave me pause for concern. I think in my reading of the notes of the bill, there seemed to be an assumption that GPs would be involved in this work, and in fact they might be the coordinating registered medical practitioner. And I think there are potential benefits from that. I think there is a specific nature of the role of the GP in people's lives from cradle to grave, and then to the people that those people have put in, into their cradles. So I think there are some benefits around having GPs around this, especially when thinking about the context around an individual and risk of coercion. But I think one of the things that worried me the most was that context that you describe, where an individual may be seeking something, maybe seeking an assisted death, but their loved ones and their families aren't in support, and the risk of the relationship that the general practitioner, as an individual, but also within the whole organisation, how that might be completely disrupted and completely broken.
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about that particular dynamic.
Yeah, no, that's. We might return to that later discussions. Scott Murray, I mean, you were talking about in your opening remarks, you talked about palliative care almost as an umbrella term, and I'm conscious that terminology in this debate could be quite, difficult and perhaps be weaponised within this debate as to how we describe some things. So, can you talk us through the terminology a little bit as to how we have to, what clarity we need to have about what we're talking about?
Okay, thank you, Kenneth. Yeah. Yes, this bill and the Medical Advisory Group report use a very wide and early definition of terminal illness, so that assisted suicide may be legal for any person who has, quote, progressive disease that can reasonably be expected to cause their death. This definition of the terminal illness was brought into practice in Scotland in 2020, supported by the Chief Medical Officer, specifically so that such patients might be identified for disability assistance and palliative care earlier, and the legal side changed then. And it certainly wasn't there so that they would be entitled to assisted suicide at that early time in the course of their illness. You might think, well, how would it come down practically? How would people be sorted to actually be eligible? Well, the tool that's recommended to GPs and other ones is called the Supportive and Palliative Care Indicator Tool. Now, I know it quite well because I actually, together with Kirsty Boyd, invented it, started it a number of years ago. And I've got a copy here. And so this is the guidance that GPs will get and others to assess if someone's eligible. So operationalising this, for an instance, would be, for instance, if you have a heart problem and you're breathless at rest, okay, that person will be permitted legally. That's how things would work out. Respiratory disease, also breathlessness at rest, that ticks the box. Kidney disease, people on dialysis, that would also probably tick the box. Liver transplant, folk with dementia unable to dress. You see, they have dementia plus this extra bit that is starting to progress. And progression is, these are highlighted so that we as GPs can identify people who are just starting to need a bit more extra support so we can start. And this now is a very popular tool. It's actually been translated into 13 different languages throughout the world, in every continent. And it's now the way to take forward early palliative care. And I have colleagues throughout doing this. And so to find it as a definition, it was designed, the definition was there so we could start early palliative care. That's what this tool does. And it's now being used, not for that, but to identify people for assisted dying, assisted suicide. So it's used not for the purpose for which it is intended. And we started the tool, the latest one in that 2022 is the one that's with the papers there, but it shows you that it's very early. So it's bringing together sort of a chronic illness and terminal care. And most people's understanding of terminal care, Kenny, is it's the last few weeks or days of life. I mean, terminal care, he's needing terminal care. That's the sort of thing, Or it's terminal, he's NASA, it's as though that person is in risk of dying imminently, soon. But now, terminal means it's likely that illness they've got, well, I identified it so that I know that person will start thinking about and needs support to consider how the illness will go, not that they would be offered. So I'd rather they get a good offer of early palliative care and working on that, talking about things, talking about the meaning. Pain without meaning is unbearable. So we're starting to address these issues. So technically, this is a very, very early terminal care, which I don't think appears elsewhere throughout the world. That's what people... So the man in the street voting for terminal care is thinking it's that rather than this earlier. So I think there's an issue there.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. So we've looked at the context. We've now looked at some. We've only scratched the surface, I'm aware, of some of the lessons and warnings from elsewhere and some of the considerations from interested groups. This last section, before we go to you guys for questions, we're going to look at practicalities. What happens now? Where do we go from here? And perhaps, Linda, we can start with you. I mean, what is the political situation here with the bill? How's it likely to pan out from this point? And what's the differences between this attempt to change the law and previous attempts?
Well, I'm not going to be tempted into saying how it's going to outcome at the end of the day. I'm far too cautious for that. The bill has moved on considerably from the very first bill that we had, which was in 2010, and then there was another one around about 2015, with different issues arising then as well. The first bill was quite a narrow approach, and it was very much concerned, I suppose, with the ECHR side of it, so the European Convention rights side of it, but also in ensuring that anybody involved in it was not going to find themselves subject to either the criminal or the civil law at that stage. And that, I think, was very much a determining approach, because people were being prosecuted for assisting people who wanted to go to Europe to receive treatment in Switzerland. And there was a real concern that that should not be an issue arising out of the first bill. So it was quite an inflexible kind of bill. And it raised a whole lot of questions, some of which are still there today, but perhaps not quite as acute, about if doctors were being involved, how far was the conscientious objection going to be allowed? What was going to happen? Were doctors going to get deregistered by the BMA or on the various other registrations? Nurses that were being involved. And round about the same time, there was also concern around the abortion, and there were two important cases in Scotland at that time around abortion, Montgomery and Dugan, which gave much more clarity as to how much information you had to provide in the context of sensitive and complex cases. So a lot of these kind of issues that arose first time round aren't there. And the emphasis now is very much more on the individual making a decision and having the right to make that individual and take it forward. It doesn't mean that the current bill still hasn't got issues both around ECHR and also around how matters arise. I mean, the point that was raised by Kirsty about not saying you have to consult the family members and what happens if family members aren't in agreement, there is a provision as part of the assessment process which says that you have to discuss the request with those close to the person. So what does that mean? Do you have a clunky list, which is not what's happened in this, to say you have to go through all these people, and what does some person further up the list have more rights than other persons? Or do you leave that close to the person, because that might not be a family member at all. It might be somebody who's your neighbour or whatever. So there's all sorts of issues that will still have to be discussed, but that doesn't mean there can't be a proper solution found for it, but they do need to be taken forward. And there's going to be a lot of issues of that kind that will still have to be addressed in this particular bill. But part of the whole discussion is for those things to be discussed in a reasonable and a balanced way, to see whether or not you can reach some kind of balancing exercise, because that's what any piece of legislation of this kind is going to be, a balancing exercise of the rights of all the people involved, and people to be satisfied that their views are being listened to and heard, but at the end of the day there is the protection that I mentioned at the very beginning for everybody involved in the process.
Thank you, Linda. No, I'm conscious of time. Want to get to the Q&A in about 5 minutes. So if we can ask the remaining panellists in this section maybe to kind of keep their answers brief. Apologies. It's my fault for not keeping you in line earlier on. Kirsten, Linda mentioned there conscientious objectors. What concerns do you have about the considerations for medical staff who are going to be asked to deliver assisted dying?
Yeah, so I think they're quite significant. So I think the institutions around the medical profession have had a shift and are generally sitting in a neutral position. But I think the last time there was a poll on preparedness to be involved, it was still sitting at a fairly low percentage, and a significant number of doctors certainly expressing that they, although they wouldn't be opposed to it, they didn't necessarily want to be involved in it. And I think there would have to be quite a lot of discussion and clarity around those parameters. I found again, the notes are relating to the bill on the position of conscientious objector a little bit confusing, and it seemed to detail that it was the responsibility of the individual to prove, should it be questioned, that they're legally allowed to conscientiously object. And as a practitioner, that made me slightly worried about why that burden would fall on me as an individual. I think if we've got a low uptake of medical practitioners wanting to be involved, and it is a role that's going to be expected of doctors, then I guess there's a concern for patients who are then looking for this to be administered and delivered to them as part of their care journey, who then struggle. So I think there would need to be quite a lot of consideration around having robust pathways and adequate training. And I think there's a balance around the type of person who would be best placed to deliver this type of care. I think it's obviously profoundly complex and emotional, and there would be a specialism within getting those assessments as perfect as possible. And so therefore, I think that makes you think you're looking for people with an expertise in that. But again, I can also understand the role potentially for your generalist and the person who has delivered the majority of your care also possibly being desired to be in that role. And so I think there's a good bit of exploration that needs to take place around the potential for the different sorts of provider. Interestingly, again, in the notes, though, there was none of that expected to be captured from the data that's expected from Public Health Scotland. There were a number of parameters that the bill was seeking to ensure that was collected and reported on an annual basis, and yet which practitioner this responsibility was falling to wasn't part of that, nor was, as far as I could see, where this was happening in what localities, to know if there are particular areas where this happens across society. There wasn't anything also around the impact on the workforce. There was no workforce data mentioned in that, so I think that's something that would still be worth considering. And then as a tangent, but a critical inherent part of that is this is going to be considered part of the care that someone's receiving in their final days. And the nature of care is to be emotionally affected by something. And again, the bill doesn't speak to what level of support or supervision anyone who is delivering this care would reasonably expect to get. And I would be loath to see this happen without a reasonable provision of supervision and support.
Yeah, thank you. Right. Thank you for keeping that tight. Scott Murray, who would be eligible? Who should be eligible and who shouldn't be eligible?
I've covered most of that, I think,
yes.
in as far as the practical outworking in this session would be using this guidance.
I was thinking in
there.
particular, like some of the examples from Canada, for example, people who had mental illnesses, who felt just generally worthless, who for socioeconomic reasons, who had other than terminal medical conditions, were coming forward for assisted dying. Yes,
the guidance actually of this list, which is meant to be used, doesn't say very much about these illnesses. And so, that would be a gap in that. Just now I would alert Liam to that. But I just wanted to mention that in my experience, most deaths can be peaceful, within the current scenario and support. And journalists like yourself can dramatise, and TVs do that, but there are many peaceful deaths where people are at peace, you know. And there might be a danger in upsetting that mechanism where the patient can trust the GP or others to look after the best interest, and not. If I said all these things and said, oh, and by the way, I in Canada they have to offer a assisted suicide or MAIDs. And that would may alter the relationship there in a large group of deaths, which are in there, as I said, there are 50,000. Whereas I think initially the thought is there might be 25 a year going to 500. You know, it's 1.1%. So I think there's a risk of relationships being harder.
And Scott McKenna, sorry, Linda.
One point later on.
Sure, yeah.
Related to that.
Scott McKenna, I mean, on the thing about conscientious objectors, could you see conscientious objectors within religious communities? You're saying that the churches would come round to it. I wonder if that would be the case for every individual cleric or minister, priest, imam.
Obviously true that, perhaps an example might be the way the religious communities have responded to same-sex relationships.
Right.
Some have completely welcomed it and are hugely supportive, and some have not. And that is likely that spectrum would probably come again. I suppose the difference is it really is about trying to support people and not invalidate their decision, but to support people in their last hours, days. But I would expect a degree of spectrum.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for keeping that brief. Do you mind if we come to your point during quick questions and answers? Do you mind, Linda?
Yeah.
Okay, that'd be fine. Thank you. Margaret, do you have concerns there might be barriers to people for all kinds of reasons, socioeconomic reasons?
Totally. So one of my really big concerns is, you know, in general, I'm opposed to the medical industrial power complex. But specifically here, we're giving doctors more power. But is this the power we want to be giving doctors? I would like the power to say, I'm going to give you perfect palliative care with loads of staff, everything you need, all the resources that you want for the last few weeks of your life. Give me that power in a bill, please, first.
No, thank you for keeping that brief. Actually, do you want to come back on your point now, just very briefly?
Yeah, it's a very brief point on the question of
Do you want the microphone?
Sorry, not doing my job.
a very brief point about the question of mental disorders and
Yes.
people in that context. It's not unknown for somebody to have a mental disorder, but to be their medication to be totally stabilised, their general condition to be fine, but they may also be suffering from a terminal illness. And at the moment, in the context of how the bill is drafted, that person would be excluded from that, despite the fact they are perfectly capable of making a decision which would be a reasoned decision in the same way as somebody who perhaps is not suffering from a mental disorder, because that may be totally related. Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I wonder if it's something that perhaps we should be thinking about. Are there particular categories? And then just to make it even more complicated, the whole question of what a mental disorder is up in the air at the moment, because we've got conventions coming in which are to be adapted from Europe on questions of disability, and equally we have, I mentioned the bill earlier on, there's a whole Scott review looking at mental health and mental disorder, and then we also have the Human Rights Act, which also will cut across aspects of mental disorder. So making decisions now about what mental disorder is may or may not have an ongoing impact and have to be looked at again very quickly, potentially in the context of ongoing review of that as well. So it's a big issue there, I think, and as I say, I don't know the answer.
Yeah, thank you for intervening on that, because I think it was a really important point to make on the practicalities. Over to you, the audience. Now, the time for this is shorter than I would like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions, perhaps 3 questions at a time, and then ask the panel to take one of those questions that appeals to them or they think they've got something pertinent to say. and we'll deal with it that way. We'll try and get through as many people as we can. So we have Leslie Ann and Jess with microphones. So if you want to raise your hand, and if you want to say who you are, and if you represent any organisation or just represent your fine good self, tell us who you are if you feel comfortable doing that. And if you can address the panel generally rather than specifics, that would be useful. We'll have a woman right at the front here. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for a very illuminating discussion. It's around palliative care. Is the mic on? Yeah?
It is, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I was diagnosed with cancer and I'm hopefully cancer-free and it doesn't return. But I had a friend who died just recently, alone, not alone with someone, but in a hospice here in Edinburgh. And she had no family, she wasn't married, and a friend of her network who is a retired nurse elected to be with her. Now, my friend, she had a horrible death in this hospice. And back to the thing that you were saying, this friend who was there with her near to the end is completely traumatised and is in a situation of extreme distress. And she's not young, she's a bit older than me. And my fear, well, there's things I'm maybe kind of jump back and forth. I mean, how can, there was something in Radio Scotland, because my friend who died in the hospice, I don't know what the term is, it's where something happens and a woman phoned into Radio Scotland where her husband, where something happens and the person becomes more than just agitated, and it had a medical terminology. So it's my fear, because I would like to have the right for me, not to suggest, that anybody else who doesn't want to have the opportunity, and I don't like the term assisted suicide. To me, it's assisted dying and an assisted part of life, because death is ultimately part of life, and nobody's getting out of this alive. So it's really the kind of the concern, and I think what you were saying, I can't remember your name, that if there was a certainty of a complete wraparound, end of life care, but with that, I think opportunity, and I'll close on this, to have the right and the possibility, if you really feel that this is what you need to be able to have that autonomy and right of life and right of end of life.
Thank you. Thank you for your honesty there and for telling us your circumstances. Next question, the guy here.
Hi, my name's Gregor McElvogue. I'm here as an individual. I don't represent anybody other than myself, although obviously I have family members. So one thing that I think has been missing so far in what the panel has presented is where we are today. So you provided context at the beginning, but I think it would be helpful to understand what the actual context is today in Scotland before any bills come forward, as opposed to what we might hear from England and Wales, because I believe it's very different. We've never had in Scots law the definition of assisting a suicide, and that suicide itself, I believe, has not actually been illegal under Scots law unless you cause public disorder. So I think it would be useful to understand where we stand today, and therefore what the bill is trying to change or add in addition to where we currently stand.
Thank you, sir. I think we can do that. The perfect person for that. One more, and then I'll ask the panel to pick up things. This lady right at the back in grey.
Thank you for what you've all said. Given the lapse of time, as it were, between the earlier attempts at legislation in Scotland and now, what is your view on society's failure adequately to discuss and have dialogue on these issues, certainly on an intergenerational basis, because I think there aren't very many relatively young people here in the audience, and I think that discussion needs to be intergenerational as well as interfaith and interdisciplinary. And I think we have failed society by not having that dialogue adequately and widely enough until now.
That's fine, thank you. I'm going to take one more question, actually, because I want there to be a whole range of things that yeah, we've got people coming in online with questions. So we can have one of those from Leslie Ann.
Given the issues with social care and care home costs, how do we ensure that the individual's decision is not influenced by the pressure of being unable to meet these costs or feeling they are a burden?
It's a really good question. I think a lot of people in the room will have personal circumstances that they can relate to that. Okay, thank you. That's a good selection. Can I ask, well, Linda, you're the most obvious person to address this chap's concerns here.
The case law from England is very persuasive in the context of Scotland. You're right that there isn't a crime of assisted suicide, but the case law in Scotland was such that if you assisted somebody to kill themselves, you may well find yourself subject to the criminal law in the context of manslaughter or homicide of some kind. There was a case a number of years ago involving Law Hospital, which was a case where nutrition and both nutrition and liquid was being withdrawn. That was what was to happen from an individual who was in a vegetative state, as it was at that time. And the hospital went to the court and applied to something which is called the parens patriae, which is some very ancient Scots law idea. And in essence, what the court was asked to do was to allow the nutrition to be withdrawn. At that time, I was the solicitor acting for the Lord Advocate at that time, and he was asked to give a provision to say that this was all right, and therefore he would not be prosecuting individuals, doctors in that case, who were withdrawing it. And being a lawyer, he turned it round the other way, and it wasn't a saying, I won't do it. It's that I will further consider this, but it is basically, it came as close to as he could to say that he would not prosecute in the circumstances where application was made to the Court of Session. So that is the situation that we're currently in. There have been very few cases since then. I don't know how it's working in practice in the community, with the medical community, and I probably don't want to know in some cases, but that's certainly the uncertainty of the position of Scots law at the moment, which is why having a piece of legislation which at least gave some protection both to the individuals and to those involved is probably something that we should be fast considering.
Thank you for that. That's a very good answer, a very comprehensive answer. Reverend Scott McKenna, what do you, anything that was mentioned there that you want to address?
I think there are one or two things to say. I think the use of the word suicide is pejorative. It's a decision. I think the evidence would be that people who commit suicide, and suicide really is always a pastoral sadness and tragedy, but people who commit suicide want to die. And I think people who want assisted dying want to live. And if they could get better, they would. So I think that was one of the reasons I thought Margot MacDonald's bill was flawed, because she called it suicide. I also think another aspect to this discussion is that we wouldn't want to leave here with the impression that palliative care can cope with all pain, because I think the evidence is that that's not the case. And that would be evidence from across the world. I suppose one of the things I did want to say, we talked about dialogue, intergenerational dialogue and discussion. This is to do with perceptions of death and dying. I'll not give you the whole history, but over the last 200 years, how our society has dealt with death and dying has changed. In the Victorian period, people were concerned about the soul. By the end of the First World War, there had been so much horrendous death, and also with the Spanish flu, that people wanted a pain-free, quick death. And then by the end of the Second World War, the shift was away from the family home into the hospital. And so the family, so it was away from the family to the professionals. And that has that is a cultural change which has an impact on conversations. And I think today, people want to try and rebalance some of that. And the evidence from people who have chosen an assisted death is that they are forced to have that conversation. And there's lots of evidence of people who opt for an assisted death. Families are forced to have the conversations.
And perhaps, with as I think Kirsten said, COVID has maybe had an impact.
I'm sure
on how
that's right
people
as well.
regard
I'm sure that's right as
death
well.
And the threat of death.
Yeah, quite so.
Yeah. Kirsten, what do you want to take from what's going on here?
So I guess
Sorry.
the online question, I think, really stops you in your tracks, and I think it reflects what the societal dialogue, the morality question, the legal question is about, that balance around societies seeking out greater autonomy in the moment of death, but that being balanced in the legislation in a way that protects the vulnerable. And I think, as Margaret was highlighting, the need to be able to have more robust palliative care in some instances, but in other instances to be able to have adequate social care for people. So there's mention in the bill around being able to assess for risks of coercion, but they're articulated as external. But I think that question about what if your circumstances are so dire that there's that interpersonal coercion is another thing that we would want to be able to protect against, and a paucity of adequate social care or entrenched poverty should not be reasons why people find themselves in these. That's not what the intention of the bill would be, but that's what it still would need to protect against. Yeah,
people not wanting to be a burden in all kinds of ways, financial burden as well as kind of emotional burden.
And whilst assisted dying might be an active care, there are those broader ways in which we need to be able to care for the vulnerable.
Margaret, what do you take from that?
No, I reflect very, very strongly on what Kirsten is saying. There's a few things in that. Earlier on, I think we were talking about the feeling of, people want an individual autonomy, they want to be able to enact their own wishes. And in many ways, I can completely get where people are coming from. But I wonder why that is. And is it because we feel as though we cannot rely on society or doctors or medicine to help us in our hour of need? And if that was the case, that would be a tragedy, I think. And it may mean that we're trying to frame the problem in the wrong terms almost. And I really worry that quiet voices do not get heard. And I can think during the pandemic, and I'm going to try not to cry, of patients who did not want to bother their doctor, patients who kept themselves at home when they were really sick and ill and struggling because they felt as though they did not have value or they were not entitled to the same care as other people. And continually in general practice, we are trying to struggle to make sure the resources go to the right people. And it is so difficult to do even when you're trying really hard to do it. And I really worry that there are people in society who will go from feeling that they are, taking up resources, that they are taking up space that they shouldn't do, that they end up feeling that they have a duty to die. And I think that would be an absolute tragedy.
Thank you very much. That's very powerful. Scott, what do you want to draw?
Thanks. I just say I'm so sorry to hear about the retired nurse who had such a horrible death that you described there. We need to improve palliative care. Hospice dying is 1 or 2%, quite a small percentage, of course, and it can be lonely even there, when folk are trying their best and they know what good palliative care could be. But we do need to do that, and we have to start this early dialogue in the course of the illness. That it was hard to make a decision at the very end there when she probably had delirium, might be the condition she had then, by the sound of it. But another phrase I'd just like to mention about the public discourse about death and dying, the concept of realistic utopia. That's an interesting. What would Scotland look like? A realistic utopia for death and dying in Scotland be? Because there was a Lancet Commission around about 60 pages that we wrote a couple of years ago. Richard Smith and others, we wrote it. And we're trying to ask, it was called The Value of Death, because death has its own implicit value. If we didn't die, next generation would come human. So there's lots of actually positives about it. People can grow. Dying can, suffering can produce endurance. I'm looking to my theological friend, and suffering and character growth. And I've sometimes seen that as well. So those are my thoughts there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for keeping that brief. We have 10 minutes left, so let's try and keep maybe 3 or 4 questions, but very brief questions and as succinct as you could possibly be. A challenge. Get your internal sub-editor to go through what you're trying to say. And again, with the panellists, we'll try and keep it very tight. There's a man in a green coat here.
Thank you. To go slightly off kilter, could you encourage Mr. McArthur to speak and give us his reflections on what he's heard?
That's a very good point. Yeah. Mother. And the chap with the waistcoat thing.
Thank you. It's been really, really helpful and honest conversation this evening. Thank you. I'm Aaron Chopra. I'm the Medical Director of the Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland. I am not speaking on behalf of the Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland. We haven't taken an organisational position yet. We'll wait for the consultation. The question that I did want to ask, though, was around scrutiny and whether the panellists feel that there's enough scrutiny after the process that's described within the bill at the moment. And if not, what more scrutiny would they like to see afterwards? I know that there is detail about Public Health Scotland and quantitative numbers, data, but I wonder whether we should go beyond that and what form that might take. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Perhaps one more? Was there one? There's a woman there. Thank you.
My name is Alison Smith, and I'm just here as an individual. But hasn't assisted dying always been?
Speak microphone. Yep.
Hasn't assisted dying always been practiced by doctors in hospitals anyway? The Yorkshire programme, was that not a withdrawal of food and water to people? And either that or overdosing with morphine? Surely these things have always been practiced anyway within the medical practice.
Okay, thank you. I took this chap's point about we have the expert, Mr. McArthur, on this. And can we have a microphone for Liam? I'm going to ask Liam, I'm not going to ask you to address a general point. I want to ask you a specific question. And my specific question is, what have you learned this evening that you didn't already know? What point or question will you take away that's given you pause for consideration and thought from this evening? Please.
What have I learned? I mean, I've immersed myself in this for the best part of the last 2.5 years. There's different takes on a lot of issues I'm more familiar with, and I think each time you hear an argument presented in a slightly different way, it gives you pause for thought. So I come away from this with a lot more to think about, albeit the terrain we've covered, I think quite reasonably, is terrain that I'm fairly familiar with. If I could maybe just, given that you've handed me a mic, maybe address the point that you suggested was coming my way after Margaret made it earlier on, in terms of I suppose the capacity of the Scottish Parliament to deal with an issue of this time. I think almost without doubt the Gender Recognition Act debate, such as it was amongst the most profoundly depressing in many respects that I'd been engaged in. I was engaged in it less than some of my colleagues on the League Committee, but nevertheless I can't remember an occasion where an issue was being wrestled with by the Parliament where there were those on both sides who, in a sense, felt it legitimate to argue that somebody didn't have a right to have a voice in that debate. And that felt like a very precarious place to be. I don't think it's going to help going into further detail about the rights and wrongs of that, but that was a profound difference in that debate to any that I've experienced in 17 years I've been in the Parliament.
And how confident are you? What gives you confidence that the same thing wouldn't happen again?
Because we're having this meeting now, Kenny. This would not have happened in relation to GRR. There is no question about it. This is the debate where, if you look at the protagonists in the parliamentary debate on GRR and try and map it with where we are on assisted dying, there is very little overlap at all. The tone and the tenor of the debate that we've had on assisted dying now, in the same way as it was in 2014-15 when the last bill was in place, and broadly similar to the one back in 2010, is far more measured, far more respectful. I think fundamentally, I can't think of another issue which come back to the Scottish Parliament to legislate as often as this has. And that, I think, reflects the fact that this is unfinished business. It commands overwhelming public support, and therefore parliamentarians are being confronted with the personal experience of many of their constituents. From the discussions I've had, many of the parliamentarians in this session of Parliament come with their own personal experience of losing a family member or a loved one to a bad death. And therefore, they're engaging with this in a way that I think is very, very different. We need to decide whether or not a change in the law is justified, whether the general principles of the bill are ones that we can support. And then we can get into the detail of addressing some of the concerns that Scott's raised in relation to the definition of terminal illness, some of the issues around capacity, some of the issues around ensuring that those who feel a burden, who, let's not forget at the moment, are being left without the support that they need. And maybe this is a portal into a way of addressing that. But getting into the detail of what that law looks like, we can only get into it once we've decided whether or not a change in the law is one that we support.
Thank you, Liam. Takes some encouragement from that. We only have a few minutes left, so forgive me. I'm going to ask the panel just to to be succinct on a very specific point. What do you take away from this, and what is your point to ponder from what we've heard this evening? What's given you pause? Linda, what do you think?
I think society's moved forward. I think we have moved forward to a certain extent. And I think I would agree that people are coming at the arguments from different sides, but that it is a respectful discussion. And for me, that is, I think, encouraging. I don't know where we'll end up at the end of it. And as I say, as far as the Law Society is concerned, we haven't reached a final view on it. But I think if it can proceed on that basis, recognising the difficulties that are around this issue, then I think society can only be better for it at the end of the day. I'm not going to guarantee that this is the final version, but it's certainly a very measured consideration and steps on from where we've been before. And I think we just need to remember that at the end of the day, it's an individual's decision and they need to be protected, and the people that want to help them need to be protected in the best possible way for it to be a successful outcome, if that's what the final decision is, that's the direction we're going in.
Thank you for that. Scott McKenna.
I think one of the encouraging things is the seriousness of the discussion which is taking place here tonight, but actually in lots of other places too. And I would say certainly in the church and in my own community, people are very engaged in the discussion, and most people have thought about it, which is, so the seriousness of the discussion, I think, is a great thing. And the other point I would make is that, it's, as Liam indicated, the inclusion of as many voices as possible has to be a great thing for our democracy, as well as the process we're involved in.
Thank you. Kirsten Woolley.
Thank you. I think in preparing for this evening, the thing that remains in my mind the most is that balance, as we've highlighted, around getting it right by autonomy, but making sure we're still protecting our most vulnerable in society. And Margaret and I have both, I think, spoken about some of those groups, and I think those who live in entrenched poverty, given the poverty rates in Scotland, are ones we need to deeply consider, especially when you reflect on the data from Amsterdam that demonstrate they underutilise the bill there. And so it seems to be the people who are better able to use their autonomy in day-to-day life who are best able to utilise the benefit of a bill. So I think I'm thoughtful about that. And the gentleman's question that we haven't had a chance to reply to, the bill description says it would be reviewed in 5 years by ministers, and I think I would encourage them to think more deeply and creatively about what information they do want collected and collated, because there wasn't anything qualitative about the impact that the bill was having at a societal level, and we want that both, doctors and patients are part of the same community in the same society, but we would be wanting, I think, to understand the impact for both groups. So I would encourage more thought there.
Yep. Margaret McCartney.
So I think decision making should be done with high quality evidence. If we don't have high quality evidence, we should go and get it. And part of that involves identifying uncertainties. And I think there's lots of uncertainties, some of which we've discussed here tonight, but many of which I don't think have been adequately identified, never mind addressed. And unless we know what we don't know, we're not going to start to answer it. So I would really call on a much higher quality evidence trawl before the bill comes again, so that at least the uncertainties are identified, and then you can look at what data gaps would exist and try and start to address them. And the other thing that I'm really worried about is that the quietest voices get heard. You mentioned the GRE, and hopefully they'll be learning from that. And that to me means that you go and find the most vulnerable people that you can find in society, people who did not put themselves forward to speak, people who were too shy or felt too unvalued to even do that. And you go and find them and you help them to speak and you help them to find their voice, and then you act on that as well.
And finally, Professor Scott Murray.
It's the balance, I think, between the autonomy, for a few against the possible harm to a much larger number. So there's a balance there, I think, to be thought about and considered. And the need, being a member here, of evidence, of good supported evidence. Would we make this a randomised controlled trial? Would we normally go ahead and test this type of intervention? Well, we wouldn't normally. We don't have the evidence to do it. There are a lot of risks. That's a thought. But we can hear more evidence and greater debate. We will get there.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very conscious this is a very delicate subject. I think there isn't anyone in this room who hasn't thought about this in the context of themselves or within a family tragedy or within a family bereavement. So this is intimately personal for every single person in this room. So if you're having trouble with that, then there's leaflets as you go out with some resources that might help if you want to process some of the things that have been talked about tonight, or with someone else, or just to help you do it yourself. I think it's important that we take all this on, not just intellectually, but emotionally as well. So please feel that there's support for you if you need that. I want to thank you for your questions were very good. The panel were very good. I want to thank you for coming. I want to show your appreciation for a very wise and a very learned panel this evening. Thank you.